My name is Matthew Goodman. Welcome to this CSIS event on operationalizing data free flow with trust. We're delighted that you could join us here today. We have a terrific group of experts to talk about this important topic, which I will introduce in just a second. I do want to start by thanking the Japan External Trade Organization for their support for this event. Without the support of our sponsors, we couldn't do anything, so we're very grateful to JETRO for that. So I think, as everyone knows, data is driving the global economy. We're creating data right now, and yet there are no really internationally agreed rules on data. Unlike other areas of economic activity like trade, we don't have data governance rules that are widely accepted in the world. There are bits and pieces of rules, but not an international system. And that is very much something that is under development and their discussion in various forums. Former Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe introduced the concept of data free flow with trust, or DFFT, at the World Economic Forum in January 2019. And that concept to try to fix this sort of gap in data governance globally. And that proposal ultimately received endorsement by G20 leaders at the Osaka Summit later in 2019. But there is still a lot of questions or gaps in what DFFT actually means and how it's going to actually be operationalized. And that's a challenge that Japan has taken on again in its host of the Group of Seven, the G7 grouping this year in 2023. They're trying to move this concept of DFFT from concept to actually implementation. And there will be some discussions of this topic for sure, because we had a preview of this at CSIS earlier this year from both Digital Minister Kono and METI Minister Nishimura, who mentioned that this is going to be and I think actually Prime Minister Kishida also mentioned it in his speech here in Washington in January. There's going to be a G7 Digital and Technology Ministers meeting next month in Gunma in Japan. And then the G7 leaders meeting itself will be held in Hiroshima in May. And it is likely that DFFT is going to feature in both of those summits. So today's event is designed to explore this topic of DFFT and how it might be implemented, how it might be put into practice. Before I introduce our panelists to discuss this topic, I just want to remind the audience that you can and are encouraged to ask questions of the panelists. You can use the Q&A button, I think, on your Zoom screen, and I will sort of choose a few of those questions and ask the panelists after I have a chance to ask my own questions of them after they do their introductory remarks. So if all that's clear, anytime from now on, you can start asking questions, and I'll try to remind you again to the audience. Okay, without further ado, I'm delighted to be joined by three terrific experts on this topic. It's hard to think of three better people. First is Maiko Meguro. She is Director for International Digital Strategy and International Affairs at Japan's Ministry of Economy, Trade, and Industry, better known as METI. Meguro-san is in charge of the DFFT work at METI during Japan's G7 host year, and so she knows kind of what the ins and outs of this whole story are from Japan's perspective, which is terrific. So I'll in a second call on her. But let me then introduce Andrew Wyckoff, who is Director for Science, Technology, and Innovation at the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, or again, better known as the OECD. Andy has been at the OECD for more than 30 years, and in fact has told us that he will be moving on to other adventures as soon as next month. So we're delighted to be able to capture Andy before he moves on and to really, in a way, take advantage of his tremendous expertise across the issues that we're going to be discussing today in data governance. There's nobody in the world, I think, who has as much knowledge and experience as Andy on these issues. So terrific that we could catch Andy this month. And then following him, last but not least, is Ambassador Robert Holleyman, who's, I think, familiar to a CSIS audience. He is president and CEO of Crowell and Mooring International, and he's former deputy U.S. trade representative when the U.S. was negotiating the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Robert, among other responsibilities, was in charge of the digital governance elements and left behind some terrific legacy commitments and understandings on this set of issues. And since then, he's been very actively involved in thinking and writing about these topics. So we're delighted to have Ambassador Holleyman back with us today. So that's enough for me. Let me turn over to the real experts. So let me start with Meguro-san. Please give us a sense of what Japan's priorities are, how you're handling DFFT during this G7 year. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Matthew, and CSIS for hosting this webinar on very, very important topic of DFFT, particularly operationalizing the DFFT. And I will also appreciate your kind and very informative introduction on the topic, and also myself. So it is a great pleasure to be here. And I am very much also humbled to be seated with this webinar with Director Wyckoff and Ambassador Holleyman. So in the next few minutes, I'd like to explain briefly about what would be the Japan's goal for DFFT in our G7 and beyond. So as Mr. Gutman has just explained, DFFT has been the guiding concept since 2019, when G20 has endorsed the concept, and also our late Prime Minister has launched that concept at the World Economic Forum. But in 2023, we believe that it is at the phase where we really have to work on the actual cases of a cooperation that actually moving forward with facilitating the cross-border transfer of data. So in so saying, for our G7, I think the goal is to have concrete commitment of G7 to accelerate the development of mutually functionable or interoperable policies and technical means to facilitate the cross-border transfer of data, while continue ensuring the compliance to the respective requirements related to the privacy, security, data protection, and the protection of intellectual property. So in saying operationalizing the DFFT, I think there are roughly three routes. First is building the trade rules. Of course, since 2019, there is Osaka track, and we are working on to build the strong cases for the trade rules, which can facilitate the cross-border transfer of data while respecting the trust. And second is the regulatory cooperation, and of course, upholding the common good regulatory practices. And third is the cooperation on the technology that can actually facilitate the interoperability across the different way of governances. So the first option, the trade rule, is a very powerful option. But of course, we also have to recognize that there are still remaining gaps of views about privacy, security, and other sensitive regulatory interests in coping with the need of facilitating cross-border transfer of data. I think some people are still quite sensitive about speaking on priorities on DFFT under the umbrella of trade regime, still now. So, but Japan has always been a strong advocate for free and fair digital trade and will be. And on this topic, we think it is helpful to have both tracks. We working on the existing trade track, but also we have an alternative or additional way to move forward with DFFT by putting focuses on the second mode, which is the regulatory cooperation and technological means, at the same time as a trade track. So the intention of saying this is that we already have the DFFT working from the aspects of the trade, but we also should have the lens of cross-border transfer of data, which have many different aspects in moving forward with this cross-border transfer of data. So we continue to fight against unjustifiable data protectionism. And G7 will continue to tackle the data localization for discriminatory purposes. But also, we have to see that in saying we continue to draw the line between the practices based on the protectionist intent, significant lack of transparency or lack of due processes, we also have to admit that even among the like-minded country, we also see some differences in terms of the ways they govern the data, question of data, based on various culture and social conditions. So from this aspect, or this is a background that our presidency, especially digital tech ministerial meeting, is trying to shed the light on the role of technologies to bridge the different ways of regulations and build mutually functional practices across such governances. So I'm now turning to what are the envisaged elements of this operationalization. So first element is that we need to facilitate multi-stakeholder engagement. Well, I would say that we need to institutionalize the multi-stakeholder engagement with this talk of DFFT operationalization in bridging the multi-stakeholders with the government. So, I mean, this is quite obvious because when we focus on the certain technological means or even knowledge on the data, this probably comes from the multi-stakeholder tech community, universities, businesses, rather than governments ourselves. And second, we also say that speaking of shaping the common priorities of governments, we need to have the certain evidences in terms of shaping those priorities. So what I mean by saying evidence-based is that in the past, we have discussed what are the priorities for the DFFT. We have talked that this is important, this is necessary in moving forward with DFFT. But often those talks on the different sides are based on the assumption about what are the problems, what is the barriers, what is the challenges that actually businesses, universities, and other entities are faced in moving the data on the cross-border basis on the daily basis. So what I'm saying by evidence-based is that we really champion the role of experts who actually study the voices of those stakeholders and identify what are the challenges and propose based on their expertise about what would be the good policy option as well as technology option that is useful to provide solution to those challenges. So in this regard, the Japanese government established the expert group on DFFT, gathering the representative scholars as well as the representative of businesses and civil society representative to provide information about what are the challenges faced by those multi-stakeholders and also recommend the way to cope with this. And also here, Director Wyckoff is attending. We are also really appreciative of the role of OECD in also providing those evidences in terms of the cross-border transfer of data, and we really supporting the ongoing study on the challenges faced by the businesses in cross-border transfer of data, and also providing an initial set of policy inventory which can cope with those challenges. And I spoke about this evidence basis from the aspects from the government to shape the priorities. But we also have to think about what are the solutions. So this operationalization, from our perspective, we have to focus on the outcomes. It have to be project-oriented to cope with those challenges rather than speaking about assumptions or concepts. I mean, we need to speak about principle. Concepts are also important. We should continue discussing with this. But we also have to focus on the actual cases of cooperation that can provide to the problems, challenges that which businesses, universities, and other entities who need to transfer the data are facing. So that's why that in the third pillar, we say that this operationalization, we need to hold the solution-oriented approach as the priority. And lastly, and not the least, as actually Matthew mentioned in the beginning, rightly, we actually lack the general rules or framework even placed to discuss this question of cross-border transfer of data with trust. Because the question of trust relates to so many different issues like privacy, security, trade, intellectual property, and there is no single place or forum that we can discuss about how we can cope with the issues coming out of those different areas of regulation, policies, and so on. So we think that we need to have a place or general forum on data rather than specific aspects of DFFT And we can bring together the stakeholders, including governments and other stakeholders, to discuss the challenges and priorities and move forward with the actual solution to operationalize the DFFT. So in this regard, Japanese government is launching the multi-stakeholder forum, what we call institutional arrangement on partnership. I mean, the name can change later, but at this one, we call this as an institutional arrangement on partnership to implement the priorities to move forward with the DFFT based on the project, which according to the priorities and also the challenges, which shapes the priorities. So in the past, without this sort of general international place to work on the common project, there was always the political priorities on DFFT coming from G7, G20, and other high-level political forums. But implementation was always ad hoc basis. It was left for the willingness of each country to take up one of those priorities and work on that. But I have to also say that there is a great achievement on the government access principle on data held by the private sectors, which is also advocated and led actually by the OECD, CDEP. Anyway, so to wrap up, because my time is limited, our goal, Japan's goal on the DFFT on this G7 and beyond is to institutionalize the engagement of multi-stakeholders. And also we uphold evidence-based approach and outcome project-focused approach. And most importantly, we need to stock take and hopefully set the high-level political priorities for operationalizing DFFT to give a good instruction for all those multi-stakeholders, including ourselves, to work together and focus the political resources to create actual cases of cooperation. And from that perspective, we are moving forward of launching this institutional arrangement for partnership to provide a place to work together. So that is all from me. Thank you so much. And we look forward to discussion and questions. Thank you.
Well, that was wonderful, Meguro-san. Really very clear, very compelling presentation of Japan's objectives and how you're looking at this. Really lots to think about and talk about there. So thank you so much for that introductory laydown for us. So thanks so much. And now I'm going to turn to Andy Wyckoff. So Andy, please go ahead.
Well, again, thanks to you, Matthew, and CSIS for organizing what is an incredibly timely event on really the issue of the day, as Director Meguro points to. Just very quickly, the OECD has been involved in data from even before when I started work here. Way back in 1980, we did the first privacy guidelines that acted as the basis for a lot of OECD countries. There was even work in 1985 on trans-border data already going on. But Matthew, as you said, data then was a lot different than it is now. And that's even more true for data flows. As you indicated, basically, almost all economic activity throws off a data trail now, and you just can't do modern business, and I'm sure the ambassador will refer to this, without data. And that, of course, gets the attention of the OECD because that's what we're about. We're about economic development and cooperation. And so this is just very much in our DNA. Our kind of more modern work on this started in 2013. And we came out with a report in 2015 I'm very fond of called Data-Driven Innovation, which kind of was trying to tell people, hey, this is a new resource that we need to be attentive to and needs new rules. And as you have said, and Maiko said, we're in kind of a vacuum at the moment. This actually gained some momentum here, and it led to what we call a horizontal project starting in 2017 called Going Digital. And OECD has some weaknesses, I'd be the first one to say, but one of our real strengths is we cover almost every policy issue under one relatively small roof here in Paris. So we can look at complex issues like the digital transformation from a multidisciplinary perspective. And that's what we started doing. And in the last phase of this Going Digital project has actually focused specifically on data governance. And so we drew together not only our expertise that we have in the directorate that I had, but also expertise from the tax people here at the OECD, from the transportation people, and from the trade community, just to name three. And we've just finished this. And one of the four modules was exactly on cross-border data flows. And as Maiko has said, Japan's been incredibly generous in supporting some of our work in this area to build the evidence base. And I think what's great about the evidence base is you peel away some of the passion and politics, and you begin to get down to exactly what are the barriers and how can we surmount these. As she alluded to, this helped us begin what were 2-year negotiations here on what's called government access to personal data held by private firms. It's a really long title, but basically the work sought to elaborate what's a derogation in those privacy guidelines I refer to about government access to personal information. And this is just fundamental to every democracy that's trying to ensure its security and integrity. And for the first time, this led to really, I think, unprecedented international cooperation on thorny issues, which some of the experts in your audience will know as Schrems 1 and Schrems 2, these European Court of Justice judgments that invalidated data flows. But I think hopefully this work will support what I hope will come into force, a robust EU-US data transfer agreement that we hope comes soon. While the negotiations were not easy, I think we did manage to get agreement, and ministers adopted a declaration on this exact area last December in Spain. And I think it's a testament to the importance of a forum that where people can come together and discuss tough issues. And I should point out that the Committee on Digital Economy Policy at the OECD is a little bit unusual, is it has an institutional arrangement where 4 different stakeholder groups are given a seat at the table: business, organized labor, the technical community, which is incredibly important, and civil society. Now, I won't go into the declaration. You can probably find them on our website. But they set out principles and procedures for that I think enshrine transparency, accountability, and due process that I think even go beyond the EU-US debate and generally differentiate OECD countries from authoritarian states. And now we're going to work to socialize those principles and get the greater global community discussing about their substance and how to promote data flows. But it's what Maiko talks about, moving from principles to practice. Okay, what does some of this really look like? And it's about identifying good practices. That's classic OECD work, developing the evidence base as she was talking about, and then hopefully forging what are consensus-based policy standards so that we can really begin to go forward on this. Let me just end by taking my hat off to Japan. I don't think they get the credit they're always due. I was there at the last G7 meeting in Takamatsu in 2016. We wouldn't be talking about AI ethics and AI principles if it hadn't been for their foresight way back in 2016. They're doing it again in 2019 with their Abe and Davos and DFFT, and I'm hopeful that this G7 presidency will have the same rich, productive outcomes as what came forward from Takamatsu. And I think now's the time is right for building momentum towards practical operationalization of DFFT. And we at the OECD are certainly happy to help. And I look forward to the further discussion here and comments and questions from you in the discussion that's forthcoming. Thank you.
Okay, terrific, Andy. Again, very clear and thoughtful and gives us a lot to talk about. So thanks so much for that. I'm going to go right to Ambassador Holleyman, and then we'll have a discussion amongst us. So go ahead, Robert.
Thank you very much. I want to thank Matthew Goodman and, as always, CSIS for the kind invitation to join this discussion. It's a pleasure to join Meguro-san and Andy Wyckoff in this discussion. I want to begin picking up where Andy left off, which is really commending Japan for its initiative in both devising the concept of data free flow for trust, but also its determination to this initiative and all of the resonance that it has achieved to date. My role today is to provide a bit of a business perspective on the practices around data governance and DFFT. I'm offering these perspectives in my personal capacity as someone who has both worked in industry and government. They don't reflect the views of any particular company or group of companies, but let me share a couple of thoughts that I think hopefully will be valuable in the discussion today. One is that it is critical that we have these discussions. And again, Japan's role in bringing this to the forefront and certainly helping catalyze this among both the G7, but previously in the G20 and elsewhere, really centralizes the notion that we cannot accept the status quo as sufficient. And that's really because the status quo is increasingly failing us. We see that in the area of data governance, countries, economies, states are moving in directions that seek to tackle legitimate and sometimes less legitimate government purposes and objectives that have impacts on data and cross-border data flows. Secondly, we really need to think about why data and data flows matter. And for many of us who work in this area, oftentimes we speak about data in a fairly abstract context, but I also think it's important to always be sort of grounded in the issues around why data matters. Why do they matter to people? Why do they matter to entrepreneurs? Why do they matter to companies? Why do they matter to governments? Not only regulators, but also those focused on economic growth. And how do they involve civil society? And I think, I typically look at one of the best examples where I think data and the use of data has an impact on all of our lives, which is around health. The kind of advances that are being made around health, data, and the use of data, adequately protected and in many cases anonymized, are essential elements of getting both the life enabling cures, the methods of ensuring better health, and the kind of data that we can use as patients, as citizens, and providers to understand how we can live more productive, healthier lives for both our countries, ourselves, and our families. Second, my third point is that the traditional means of addressing this issue have not worked as well as they should and as well as they must. So I see in this that the G7 is an important catalyst for DFFT because it has the global reach that includes key nations from Asia, the Americas, Europe, and the UK. These countries have, in many respects, common values, attributes, and interests, and notions of privacy, data flows, trust, intellectual property are shared, although not identical even among the G7. But to make progress on data flows and trust, it's important that these economies agree on both common principles while recognizing that each has its own tradition of laws and regulations, and that these will not be identical. And what we need to be moving for is for something where we have interoperability. And I'll zoom out a bit beyond the G7, where I think this is even increasingly important. So I think we have to have understanding around the principles that we're looking for, but recognize that we have to have principles that gain traction within the G7 and also that involve a group and set of nations and economies in the rest of the world, whether it's the global South or some group of digitally focused nations beyond the G7. So the G7 is essential, but it's not sufficient. Next, I think as we think about this, I'd like to sort of maybe offer a couple of thoughts and practical suggestions. One, let me start by dispelling a myth. The myth that I'd like to dispel is that the US is not fully capable of addressing this issue because we don't have a single national privacy regime in the United States. And I think that is a myth. Yes, it poses challenges because the US does not have a single national privacy law, but we also have a long-standing tradition of laws and regulations that protect privacy, whether it's in the area of health, finance, children, deceptive practices in advertising, constitutional rights, supplemented by what many states are doing. As a former trade negotiator and US government official, it absolutely would be easier if there was a single uniform national standard in the United States. But easy doesn't mean that it is essential to have that. So yes, I joined the group of those arguing in favor of a adoption of a appropriate uniform national law in the United States. But I recognize that even in its absence, whether that is temporary or perpetual, the US has enormous credibility in speaking on these issues that matter in the global forums, whether they're the G7, the G20, or more broadly. Second, my two practical suggestions. One is that we really need to focus on interoperability. And that, I think, has to be the key in this. Vastly different perspectives, as I've noted, not only in the G7, but globally, different traditions of law and regulation. And we cannot and should not be aiming for identical provisions. In fact, we need to encompass what I think the OECD has advanced. It's certainly been picked up in other forums, such as the APEC cross-border privacy rules, which is the importance of interoperable systems that don't require identical provisions, but that can work together. My third suggestion is that we really need to look at some of the developments that are happening globally. And here I would put the global cross-border privacy rules framework as a key element of this. APEC, as the 21 economies, was good and helpful and advanced, instilling the principles of the APEC cross-border privacy rules, building upon the OECD privacy principles and elements of interoperability. That's now been taken beyond APEC to become the global cross-border privacy rule system. That is an initiative that the US government, Japan, and others have actively pursued and are pursuing, recognizing that that system has value in other parts of the world. And I know there are discussions that are happening ranging from Brazil to Kenya to others around how might these systems be applicable in both advancing data protection, trust, and interoperability as other countries, even beyond the 21 economies of APEC, look to advance their core principles. And finally, let me just conclude by saying that it's a privilege to be part of this discussion. And I encourage, as Japan has offered and Meguro-san has offered in these discussions, to recognize the important role of multi-stakeholder consultations and discussions in this. I think at this table, as we move forward, we need government, we need civil society, we need citizens, and we need industry. These are issues that matter, not just in economic terms, but they're issues that matter to those who govern and those of us who are governed. They matter to our future. And so I want to commend CSIS for convening us today. Look forward to the discussions that follow. And it's a privilege to be here. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Robert. Really, again, terrific, clear, and compelling. And you've anticipated some of the questions, terrific questions that we're getting from the audience. And I encourage more, although I'm going to have a hard time getting through all of them already, I can see. Let me, before turning to the audience questions, let me ask a couple of questions. I mean, there's so many things to cover here, but I think if we did a word cloud here of all the things that people have said, the word trust would certainly appear in large letters. I mean, it's in data free flow with trust, of course, but the actual definition of this term is a little bit unclear. Meguro-san suggested it included privacy, security, intellectual property protection, some other things. But I guess anybody who wants to comment on how we refine or whether we need to really define the term trust, or do we kind of know it when we see it? And is that key to getting some of the, again, another big word that I heard a lot was interoperability. If we're not going to all agree on one approach, getting a set of approaches that are sort of based on a common set of principles and objectives that then can be sort of plugged together in some way seems sensible, but is there enough basis of understanding about those elements of trust to be able to do that in particular? And I hate to, I'm sorry, it's a long question, but because I'm trying to give you time to think and answer any aspect of it. But particularly, it feels to me like the United States and European Union still have some difference of view on those issues around, privacy, even security and other issues. Probably not as big differences as with China and other countries that are trying to assert their preferred approach to data governance, but there are some pretty substantial differences. Are we going to be able to bridge these enough to make the systems interoperable? So I'm throwing out a lot there because I want to see how people react. And, Meguro-san, if you want to start, I'd appreciate your thoughts.
Sure. Thank you so much for your great question. And that is really the tough question that at the core of our policy proposal on the operationalization of DFFT. I mean, being a Japanese government officer, I'm not involved in this, for example, what you mentioned as US, European Union differences, Atlantic differences on the question of privacy and other relevant issues. But I think that it's quite difficult to solve those problems easily. The thing is that privacy is quite important for certain jurisdiction. It is a part of the constitutional value, but also security or other aspects are also quite important. And it's very difficult to put the priority underneath the same umbrella. It's just two are absolutely important. That's it. So from that aspect, Japan really thinks that we should really think about certain technological solution that we don't have to change the regulation, but we can achieve the interoperability. But also we would like to push for the forum of multilateral and multi-stakeholder place for this, because we can bring the knowledge from the tech community, university, but also aspects of the civil society, just as Ambassador Holleyman mentioned. And of course, businesses can also have a great solution. But also, we should have certain multilateral cooperation in terms of the many different governments, because when you're talking about sensitive topics like privacy or security in the bilateral context, it's quite difficult to actually work on the compromises, since both sides have different stakeholders watching the government, how they can do well in terms of their important topics. Whereas if you have sort of multilateral place like a G7 or even G20, we could kind of work on the certain different bargaining games in terms of working on a certain common area that we should work on, or we can prioritize certain topics, leaving those important aside, leaving those sensitivities aside. If we could actually focus on the where we can actually have the steps perhaps smaller, but quite concrete steps. So that's how I think about how we should cope on this very difficult topic of privacy security within the DFFT.
Okay, thank you. Andy or Robert, do you have thoughts on my big question?
I'll try to be fast because I think Meguro-san did a good job of I think originally I had the naive hope that we could do this as a big bang. That's not going to happen. And I think it's coming from the bottom up, picking away at piece is the best way to do it. I like to think we contributed a piece to that puzzle with the government access rules, because that was a particularly sticking point. I agree with her as well. I think there's some technical fixes here that I think could be useful. And I guess I just want to end as someone, as a U.S. passport holder sitting in France for a very long time. Shifting geopolitics, I think, have begun to help shift positions between the U.S. and U.S. so that they're closer than they have been for a lot of my career here. So I'm cautiously optimistic.
Good. I'm glad to hear that. And I agree with you about that last comment. It does feel like we have the opportunity, at least, to try and align a little better on these and other issues as a result of world events. Robert, do you want to add any?
Sure. I'll just wrap up by saying, just as we know that all data is not the same, all concepts of trust are not the same, and they don't have equal value. So I think in this umbrella term that we have, we can define, when trust matters and when it's essential, and other areas where it may be less important. For example, we need to have trust in our global systems around how we can access and use information and data. We particularly need to have trust in areas where I would again say the US has really helped lead the way. We need to have trust about our health data, not only that it's protected, but as data is being used to advance our health, that data is both accurate and it is protected and that it is serving the purpose. We need to have trust in our financial data. We need to have trust around our kids and how we protect that. We need to have trust in our democracies and how we use that. We need to have some elements of trust, many elements as consumers. And an individual entrepreneur needs to have trust that when she's using global services in cloud computing to build her new business, that in fact the reliability of that system is there. The creator of intellectual property needs to know that when he puts new content out, that trade secret or the intellectual property can be protected. So yes, I think we need to sort of break it down into its elements to get a broader concept of trust. We need to have trust in the system, but we don't need to have equivalent trust in every single way in which data may be used. We need to have trust in the ones that are fundamental to us. And those may vary depending on the person's need or how they're using data or what types of data are being transferred.
Robert, let me flip one back to you because you anticipated a question from somebody in the audience about whether the U.S. lack of a comprehensive data privacy law is hampering U.S. ability to sort of engage on these issues and push forward its preferred approach, or even defining that preferred approach. And so you made a compelling case there, but I want to ask about sort of, in a way, a variation on that theme, which is that, it seems here in the U.S. that there is a broad understanding of the value of data flows across border for the reasons that all of you have sort of touched on. But there's also a very strong view that the U.S. shouldn't be going out into international arenas and negotiating sort of binding rules or even, strong, compelling commitments that then somehow restrict the right to regulate at home. And that term, right to regulate, is a term of art, apparently, in these debates. And I wonder, we did a little paper on sort of the Indo-Pacific economic framework and the digital pillar. And when we talked to various stakeholders, that issue came up. And I wonder how you think about that, or how you'd answer that question.
Sure. Look, any nation, certainly the United States, is going to preserve its right to regulate. Nations should preserve that right to regulate. That's sort of fundamental. The question is, where do common objectives allow the U.S. to sort of move forward to try to advance both principles that are inherent at home while preserving our right to regulate, and also advancing the principles that recognize that if every country, every economy has disparate regulations that are not interoperable, that we're going to essentially limit the ability of these data transfers to offer real value to citizens and to people. So it's a delicate balance, but it's a balance that governments are well equipped to strike. Certainly balances that the U.S. government has been striking in various forms since our inception. And yes, I think it gets into then the question of, do we need a single national data security law, privacy law? And the answer is sure, absolutely. It would be helpful to do that as a way of preserving, a way of engaging in the right to regulate. But we already regulate in core sectors that have been deemed for a long time and remain deemed to be essential for us. So this is a case where it's a false choice to say that the U.S. has to have a national data regulation or a privacy principle to be able to negotiate actively and with our head held high around the importance of privacy, security, and trust. We have a system, while not perfect, we have a system that allows us to advocate for better protections around the world. And I think we should do that, even as we look to close any loopholes or gaps that remain here at home.
Okay, helpful. Let me ask an institutional question, and then I'll bring the audience in. Sort of where, and Meguro-san, you alluded to this new institutional arrangement for partnership, but in concrete terms, where should this work be housed? There's been, I know it's probably going to make Andy uncomfortable, but there's some talk about, whether the OECD ought to be the house for this, but and have a sort of secretariat to continue to work on this and monitor and enforce whatever enforce in the way they can, sort of monitor and follow up on any commitments that are made. Problem is the OECD doesn't represent the whole world. It doesn't even represent all of the European Union. And so, is that the best place? There was talk a couple of years ago. There was a proposal, and Robert, I don't know if you were involved in this, among some private sector interests in a kind of a loose forum of data regulators, something like the Financial Stability Forum that was set up after the global financial crisis by the G20 to try to bring regulators of financial issues at that point to kind of an informal network that would then share best practices and come up with sort of soft rules that could be then implemented back at home. And there was a proposal to do something like that in the data governance area, have some new forum of data regulators. Is that a possibility? Did anybody have any thoughts about, or can you help illuminate sort of where this activity going forward beyond Japan's host year should be housed? Meguro-san, maybe starting with you. Do you guys have a particular idea on that?
Sure. Thank you so much for your good question. In terms of, we're just starting with this institutionalizing the operationalization. So from this stage, I believe that this sort of initiative or forum should be hosted under the existing international organization. Or I'm not naming which international organization, of course, but that is absolutely important, because in order to have the effective solutions or effective project, we need to have a good governance structure there. Governance is a key in the success. And that is something we should really rely on the existing resources with international organizations that have the sufficient expertise on this very important and new topic of the DFFT. But of course, I mean, we have to think about a good combination of keeping the governance, but also keeping the space of creativity and expertise to flourish on building the creative solution on this topic. So yeah, it's really a question of balances, but we're working on it.
Either Andy or Robert want to comment on the sort of where to house this. Robert, you have any thoughts?
I think I think that the opportunity is to find a way to knit together the various conversations that are happening, whether it's the U.S. and Japan with the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, it's what's happening on the global cross-border privacy rules. I think the OECD in many areas, in my experience, has really been a great catalyst for sort of bringing together parties, recognizing this needs to be beyond the OECD countries. So I won't weigh in on who should house this, but I do weigh in strongly on the view that we need greater cooperation and we need a way to convene parties, G7 and much more broadly, to make progress on this. So I'm sort of fit in this camp of all of the above is good, but we need to be working to principles that can actually have real tangible impact, because as I began by saying, the status quo is not working as well as it should, given the growing needs for data transfers, the growing amount of data that's out there.
Okay, let me try and bring in a couple of audience questions. There are a lot of good ones, and it's going to be very hard to get through all this. So I apologize in advance to folks I don't get to call on. But let me try and combine two things that are a little more technical, but interesting to see how people react. And Meguro-san, you talked about sort of technology as a way of solving some of this, and you talked about standards. And so there's a question about, which is very specific, but I'm kind of interested if anybody has any reaction, to what extent can DFFT's objectives and operationalization forget it. Anyway, how can we implement this by using quantum computing, quantum communication technology? Is there a sort of technical aspect to this that can be helpful in this regard? And if anybody can take a stab at that. But let me also ask, while you're thinking about that, there's a separate question about, is there any work on any of this in the ISO, the International Standards Organization, or any of the standards bodies that are potentially relevant here, and what is their role in trying to create a more common approach to standards that would facilitate DFFT? Either of those inspire anybody? Meguro-san, maybe.
Sure. Thank you so much for naming me. In terms of the specific technology that you have not mentioned, I mean, I'm not saying which technology is particularly useful, because that is really according to the challenges that are identified. And challenges are also the basis for the priorities. So it's really about combination, how this technology actually can work with a problem that is there. And we shouldn't actually lock into the specific technologies either. So that is why it's quite important to have the range of experts, range of stakeholders who is involving the topic of DFFT to have the wider view. In terms of ISO, I'm not the super expert on ISO, but I think the work stream on the, for example, cloud computing, work stream on the AI, there are so many relevant places. Actually, they are already discussing some relevant aspects of DFFT. That's how I understand.
Okay. Andy, do you have any thoughts on any of that?
No, just quickly that we work closely with ISO already on AI and some of these cloud and some of these other work streams, but I think the partnership works well because we then take their technical expertise and bring it into more of a political context and with the policy community. And I think it's partly that handshake that's badly needed here.
Okay. Robert, did you?
Yeah, I'll just, I also think there are elements. I know that Singapore is, Personal Data Privacy Commission has recently launched a regulatory sandbox around privacy enhancing technologies. And so while not a standards issue per se, there are also new technologies that are being developed and will be deployed that will better protect privacy. And so I think we need to recognize that there is a role, an important role for the use of technology, the use of standards, and applauding governments like Singapore who are looking at ways to explore how these can both be used and what the right regulations are.
Okay, I'm just going to take one more question, which has been asked about this multi-stakeholder effort. And one of our viewers has been involved in the project of the World Economic Forum in looking at these issues and found that there was a big challenge of getting, there was a lack of trust among the different stakeholders, government groups, civil society groups, business, others. And the question is, how can governments sort of bridge, and Japan in particular as host of the G7, how are you thinking about trying to bridge these differences? And are there sort of ways, are there processes that you think can be established to enhance or increase international participation, by civil society, research communities, presumably I'd throw in business, others, to this conversation?
Thank you. It's quite a difficult topic, but I think we should really come back to what I said, what I meant by the evidence-based approach, because we often cross in terms of values, but when it comes to the challenges, and if we collect the evidence on this, we probably have a better understanding of what are the issues there and what are the effective areas of cooperation that we have to build on. So I think the evidence-based approach is one way to bridge the completely people of the completely different background. Okay.
Any other thoughts on that? I know Robert made a pitch for it already in his opening comments for this multi-stakeholder real engagement. Is there any example through the OECD, Andy, that where this works better than other examples? Or
yeah, I mean, there's I'd like to think part of why it works at the OECD, at least in this one committee, is we've been doing it a long time. It's 2008 since this institutionalization. So the group dynamic has cemented, and there's I think a bond and a vocabulary and a trust that's common there. It's not something brand new that may have some teething problems. The other thing I would just say is I'm with our work on trusted government access, a lot of it just had to do with getting two different communities, the privacy authorities and the intelligence security people, beginning to understand each other, because they have different missions and mandates. And when you get them around the table and they begin to discuss things with an evidence base, as Maiko was saying, this helps improve the understanding.
Great. That's really helpful. Okay. Unfortunately, we're kind of winding down on time, but I want to give each speaker 30 seconds. If there's anything you want to say that we haven't covered that you think is important, or anything you want to accent, and maybe in reverse order. Robert, is there anything you'd like to add?
Sure, thank you. In addition to my thanks to CSIS and particularly to Japan's leadership in this area, I just want to emphasize to this last question we're having, the important role of the business community there. I mean, this is really a place where the infrastructure, the data, the front lines, if you will, in both protecting data and preserving trust and privacy are really held by the large number of networks among small individual companies, large companies, consumers who are really at the front lines of this. And so in any discussions, they need to be not only at the table, but they need to have sort of a permanent seat at the table. Because they're going to be critical elements of making sure that these principles of data free flow with trust are operationalized and are successful. Thank you.
And just to put an accent on that, I think it's not just big business, small business, and maybe even especially small business somehow needs to be plugged into this, because most people work for small businesses, and they're the ones who really need clear and coherent rules to be able to succeed in the global economy. So just for what it's worth, my editorial addition to your good comment. Andy, any thoughts to close up?
I would echo Ambassador Holleyman, just to add that I think there's huge heterogeneity around data itself, and we need to begin to get away from this monolithic term and begin to break it down into different types. And I hope this will make some of the conversations easier.
Really helpful. Thanks so much, Andy. And Meguro-san, you have the last word.
Yes, thank you very much, CSIS, and also METI for this great webinar. I'd like to just echo the point made by the Ambassador Holleyman and also the Director Wyckoff. But I'd just like to add one more thing, is that in responding to the point raised by the Ambassador Holleyman, Japan is also pursuing the good collaboration with the Global South as an only Asian G7 country. And also our presidency is really putting a focus on the global cooperation beyond the G7, and particularly on the topic of DFFT.
Okay, well, we'll be watching that among other things, in addition to DFFT itself, sort of the broader question of how Japan's engaging and the G7 are engaging the Global South. First in the digital ministers meeting in Gunma next month in April, and then in the summit itself in Hiroshima in May. And these issues are definitely going to be front and center. So we're just delighted that you all helped us to understand better. I'm sorry we didn't have more time to explore these issues, but the conversation is going to continue, and we welcome all of you back. But thank you so much for your time, your insight, and thanks to our audience for sticking with us. And we're going to keep following these issues at CSIS and look forward to your input and feedback on all of this. So with that, I will close us off and say, have a good day, everyone.